On a single Tuesday in July, 15 wounded American soldiers simply vanished from an official government casualty count. Not because they recovered, not because of some data correction anyone bothered to explain. They just disappeared from the tally overnight with no public statement, no clarification, nothing. And when reporters asked the Pentagon why, the answer they got was that the one person who could explain it wasn't at their desk. Stick with me for the next 30 minutes, because I'm going to walk you through exactly how America's official count of its own wounded troops from the Iran War has been rising, falling, and disappearing in ways that don't add up. What a months-long investigation has actually uncovered about the true scale of American casualties, and why even members of Congress are now openly questioning whether the Pentagon is being honest with the American public about the human cost of this war. Let's start with the basic system this entire story revolves around, because you need to understand how casualties are actually supposed to be tracked before you can appreciate how badly that system is broken down. The Pentagon maintains something called the Defense Casualty Analysis System, known as DCAS, which is specifically designed to track deceased, wounded, ill, or injured service members and report those numbers to Congress and the President. According to its own stated mission, the system's goal is to provide as accurate a reporting of military casualties as possible. That's the whole point of DCAS. It exists so that the people responsible for overseeing America's wars and the American public whose sons and daughters are actually fighting them can know with confidence how many people have been hurt or killed. But according to months of reporting from The Intercept, an investigative outlet that has been tracking this issue closely since the war began, DCAS during the Iran War has done almost the opposite of what it's supposed to do. Let's walk through the actual numbers, because watching them shift over time tells the story better than any single snapshot could. When the first ceasefire between the United States and Iran was struck back in April, the tally of American dead and wounded stood at 385. Despite that pause in the fighting, the number continued climbing over the following weeks, slowly rising to 428. Then, on a single Tuesday, without any public comment from what's now called the War Department, the number of wounded in action troops dropped by exactly 15, bringing the total down to 413. The count held roughly steady after that, with one official tally putting the grand total at 411. Nobody explained where those 15 wounded troops went. They weren't announced as having recovered. There was no press release. They were simply gone from the public count, as if they had never been wounded in the first place. According to a defense official who spoke with The Intercept about this exact discrepancy, it was genuinely difficult to tell whether Pentagon casualty analysts responsible for these numbers were, in this official's own words, grossly incompetent, or whether they had actually been ordered to manipulate the figures. Think about how remarkable that quote actually is. This isn't an outside critic or a political opponent making that accusation. This is someone inside the defense establishment itself, speaking anonymously, acknowledging that the two most plausible explanations for what happened are either serious incompetence or deliberate manipulation, with no clear way for outside observers to know which one it actually was. And this wasn't an isolated one-time glitch either. This pattern of numbers rising, falling, and being disputed has repeated itself multiple times throughout this war. Take the count of American deaths as another example. For weeks, DCAS listed 13 hostile and non-hostile American deaths during the war. Then, at one point, that number briefly rose to 14 before dropping back down to 13 again, with no explanation offered for the fluctuation. More recently, following Iran's claim that it had killed 3 American service members in Kuwait, and amid the broader collapse of yet another ceasefire, the official death toll rose again, this time to 14, reportedly reflecting the addition of a Navy commander who died in a non-combat helicopter incident on July 1st, rather than a brand new combat death. Even the wounded count has continued fluctuating in smaller ways since then, rising by 1 after that same round of fighting in Kuwait. Let's talk about one specific case that captures just how personal and how troubling these discrepancies actually are. Because this isn't just about abstract numbers on a spreadsheet. There's a soldier named Major Sorfly Davies, a signals and communications officer with the New York Army National Guard, assigned to the headquarters of the 42nd Infantry Division. According to reporting on his case, Major Davies died of a sudden illness while on duty in Camp Buehring, Kuwait, on March 6th, while deployed in support of the military operation against Iran. His own congressman, Representative Mike Lawler of New York, spoke about him directly during a memorial service, describing how Davies passed away while deployed to Kuwait, supporting that same operation. Even General Dan Kane, the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, publicly recognized Davies while honoring the war's fallen. And yet, despite a sitting congressman and the country's highest-ranking military officer both publicly acknowledging his death as connected to this war, Major Davies's name has remained missing from the Pentagon's own official casualty list for months. Reporters have asked the Pentagon repeatedly why his name is absent. According to reporting on this specific case, the Pentagon has simply ignored those requests for comment for weeks at a time. Now, you might be thinking, maybe this is just one unfortunate administrative oversight, a single name that slipped through the cracks in an otherwise reasonably accurate system. But the deeper you look into how this entire tracking system has functioned throughout this war, the more it looks less like an isolated mistake and more like a genuinely inconsistent, poorly maintained accounting of America's own military casualties. Consider this detail. On one official DCAS page, titled Casualty Summary by Casualty Category, the system listed 372 troops wounded in action, a figure 23% higher than what Central Command had separately told reporters. On an entirely different page of the exact same official government database, titled Casualty Summary by Month and Service, the listed grand total of wounded in action was lower still, at 357. Two different pages, inside the same official Pentagon casualty tracking system, supposedly reporting on the exact same war, giving two different numbers, both updated on the very same day. And there's a structural gap in how this entire system defines its own categories that makes the undercounting problem even worse. DCAS does track what it calls non-hostile deaths, meaning service members who died in accidents or from illness rather than direct enemy action. But the system doesn't include non-hostile injuries in its public reporting at all. That distinction might sound like a minor technical detail, but it has real consequences. Consider the USS Gerald R. Ford, the largest aircraft carrier deployed in this entire theater of war. A fire broke out aboard that carrier back in March. A blaze, the Navy said, started in a laundry area and wasn't combat-related. More than 200 sailors were treated for smoke inhalation or lacerations because of that fire. But because that injury wasn't classified as combat-related, none of those 200 sailors show up in the official wounded in action tally at all, even though they were injured aboard a warship actively deployed in support of active combat operations against Iran. Let's talk about the Army specifically, because according to DCAS's own figures, it's actually the Army, not the more visible Navy or Air Force, that has suffered the largest number of casualties in this war, with 251 wounded troops recorded, largely soldiers who man the interceptor missile systems positioned on bases across the region. And there's a specific, deeply serious category of injury that's only now starting to get proper attention. According to reporting on this issue, the Army is only just beginning to seek out sensors specifically designed to measure something called blast overpressure, the sudden pressure wave produced by nearby explosions, whether from incoming enemy munitions or even from the concussive blast of American weapon systems being fired by the soldier's own side. Repeated exposure to that kind of pressure wave can cause serious cognitive impairment and lasting damage to brain health, including traumatic brain injuries, the kind of invisible wound that often doesn't show up in an immediate physical examination, but can affect a service member for the rest of their life. President Trump has reportedly dismissed these kinds of brain injuries in the past, referring to them as headaches, describing them as not serious, even as Central Command has continued describing the vast majority of this war's injuries as merely minor. Let's zoom in on a few specific documented incidents that illustrate just how significant some of these undercounted casualties actually were. A 27th of March attack on Prince Sultan Air Base in Saudi Arabia damaged multiple refueling aircraft, destroyed a Boeing E-3 Sentry, and wounded at least 15 American soldiers. An American F-15 fighter jet, callsign Dude 44, was shot down over Iran, and one of the crew members rescued during a dramatic overnight mission by U.S. Special Operations Forces was, according to President Trump's own description, bleeding rather profusely and injured quite badly. An A-10 Warthog also went down near the Strait of Hormuz around the same period. And yet, according to reporting from The Intercept, Central Command failed to provide updated casualty figures reflecting these specific wounded personnel, despite more than a dozen separate requests for clarification over the following week. There's also the matter of how casualty statements themselves have simply gone stale without being corrected. At one point, a Central Command spokesperson sent a statement noting that approximately 303 American service members had been wounded since the start of the operation against Iran. That statement was already 3 days old by the time it was sent, and it excluded at least 15 troops wounded just days earlier in an attack on Prince Sultan Air Base. Outdated numbers, presented as current, becoming the official public record of how many Americans had actually been hurt in this war. So why would any of this actually matter beyond simple bureaucratic sloppiness? Here's the deeper issue. Accurate casualty reporting isn't just a matter of record-keeping for historians to sort out later. It's one of the most fundamental pieces of information a democracy needs in order to have any kind of honest public debate about whether a war is worth its cost. When Americans are trying to decide whether they support a military operation, whether Congress is trying to decide whether to continue funding it, whether military families are trying to understand the true risk their loved ones are actually facing, the number of dead and wounded is one of the single most important, most basic facts underpinning that entire conversation. If that number keeps shifting in ways nobody can explain, dropping by 15 overnight, excluding hundreds of sailors treated for smoke inhalation, omitting a soldier whose own congressman has already publicly mourned him, then the public conversation about this war is happening with genuinely incomplete, and possibly deliberately incomplete, information. And this pattern of undercounting during America's involvement in this Iran war connects to something even bigger and longer running. Even before this specific war against Iran began, American bases across the Middle East had already been increasingly targeted for well over a year following Israel's war in Gaza, starting back in October of 2023, with a mix of drones, rockets, mortars, and ballistic missiles hitting American positions repeatedly. According to reporting compiling those earlier incidents, at least 175 American troops were killed or wounded in that earlier period alone, including 3 service members who died in a January 2024 strike on a facility in Jordan known as Tower 22. Put that earlier toll together with the casualties from this current war against Iran, and one investigative analysis found that almost 750 American troops have been wounded or killed across the broader Middle East since October of 2023, a total the Pentagon has still never fully and publicly acknowledged in one consolidated, consistent figure. Let's talk about how officials have responded when directly confronted with these discrepancies, because the responses themselves tell you something important. During one specific exchange, 2 separate Pentagon spokespeople told reporters they were simply unable to field questions about why more than a dozen casualties had disappeared from the official tally, explaining that only a specific duty officer could actually answer that question, and that this particular duty officer wasn't currently at their desk. One of them reportedly said that as soon as the duty officer returned to their desk, the information could be passed along. Weeks later, according to the same ongoing reporting, that explanation still hadn't materialized into any actual public clarification. There's also a broader political context worth understanding here, because the discrepancies in casualty reporting have unfolded alongside a war that hasn't achieved several of its own publicly stated objectives either. President Trump had described goals for this military campaign that included securing what he called freedom for the people of Iran, taking the oil in Iran, and forcing what he described as Iran's unconditional surrender. None of those specific outcomes has actually been achieved as this war has dragged on, through multiple ceasefires that have repeatedly broken down and reignited. At one point, Trump stated the war would continue for as long as necessary to achieve what he described as peace throughout the Middle East, and indeed, the world. When directly asked about the cost of the war in a Tuesday interview, Trump offered a fairly blunt, almost fatalistic response, saying simply that when you have conflicts like this, you always have death, a comment that, whatever its intent, doesn't exactly resolve the specific question of why his own administration's casualty figures keep shifting in ways nobody can adequately explain. Now, to be fair and give a complete, balanced picture here, it's worth acknowledging that tracking casualties accurately in the middle of an active, chaotic, rapidly evolving war is genuinely difficult under the best of circumstances. Injuries get reported through multiple different chains of command. Some casualties take time to formally classify as combat-related versus non-combat-related, and figures from independent trackers, Pentagon statements, and formal DCAS database entries don't always align perfectly, even when everyone involved is acting in complete good faith. According to one broader review of the available casualty data, confirmed American military deaths in this war converge fairly consistently around 13 to 15 service members, but published figures for wounded personnel have varied enormously across different sources and different points in time, ranging anywhere from roughly 140 wounded according to early Pentagon statements, all the way up to figures approaching 400, with some investigative reporting alleging the true total could run even higher still. That's an enormous range of uncertainty for something as fundamentally important as knowing how many American troops have actually been hurt in an active war. But even accounting for the genuine difficulty of wartime record-keeping, the specific pattern documented here goes well beyond simple confusion or delayed reporting. Numbers dropping by exactly 15 overnight with zero public explanation. A named individual, publicly mourned by his own congressman and by the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, still missing from official casualty rolls months later. 2 different pages within the very same official government database reporting 2 different totals on the very same day. These aren't the kinds of discrepancies you'd expect from an imperfect but honestly maintained tracking system. They're the kinds of discrepancies that led one government official, speaking anonymously to reporters, to describe the entire situation using the phrase casualty cover-up. So where does this actually leave us right now as you're watching this video? The Pentagon's official tally of American dead and wounded from this war with Iran continues to shift, sometimes rising, sometimes falling, frequently without any accompanying public explanation for the change. Names of the fallen, including at least one soldier already publicly honored by his own congressman and by the country's top military officer, remain absent from official rolls months after their deaths. Hundreds of documented injuries, including sailors treated for smoke inhalation aboard one of the Navy's largest aircraft carriers, don't appear anywhere in the official wounded in action count because of how narrowly that category has been defined. And months of persistent, specific questioning from investigative reporters have largely been met with outdated statements, unreturned requests for clarification, and, in at least one documented instance, a spokesperson simply stating that the person who could actually answer the question wasn't available at their desk. This is exactly the kind of story that deserves far more sustained attention than a single day of headlines about troop numbers rising or falling. Because underneath every one of these statistics sits a real person, a soldier who died of sudden illness in Kuwait, a sailor who breathed in smoke during a shipboard fire, a fighter pilot rescued while bleeding badly after being shot down over Iranian territory. When the official record of what happened to these actual people keeps shifting without explanation, that's not simply a bureaucratic inconvenience. That's a breakdown in one of the most basic obligations any government has toward the people it sends into harm's way, and toward the public that has every right to know the true human cost of the wars being fought in its name. I want to know what you think about all of this. Do you think this pattern of shifting, unexplained casualty numbers reflects genuine incompetence inside an overwhelmed wartime bureaucracy? Or do you think there's something more deliberate going on in how these figures have been managed and reported to the public? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, because I read every single one of them, and this is exactly the kind of conversation I want happening on this channel. And if this video helped you understand a side of this war that most headlines about missile strikes and ceasefires never actually cover, share it with someone who's been following this conflict but hasn't heard about what's actually happening with America's own casualty count. Hit that like button, subscribe if you're new here, and I will see you in the next video as we keep tracking exactly how this story continues to unfold.